I never thought I'd find myself here, holding a secret that weighs heavier than any burden I've known. I can still picture that evening, the way the streetlights cast eerie shadows through the kitchen window, illuminating her face. His sister, the one I had come to resent more with each passing day. It wasn't always this way. When I first met Lena, my husband's younger sister, she seemed sweet, supportive, always showing up with that warm, radiant smile. At first I thought I was imagining things, but there was always this nagging feeling, a sense that she knew how to manipulate people's attention, especially his. Over time, my jealousy grew like a stubborn weed. Every time she'd call him late at night or show up unannounced at our doorstep, it was like she was testing me, asserting some unspoken dominance in our marriage. I watched as he softened in her presence in ways I hadn't seen in years. It hurt to see that look in his eyes, the way he laughed freely around her, a warmth he rarely showed me anymore. Soon, every glance they exchanged felt like an affront. Every story she shared about their childhood, every inside joke, every shared memory left me feeling more like an outsider in my own marriage. I tried to talk to him, but he brushed it off as insecurity, saying, "You're overthinking things." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was being ridiculous. But the jealousy gnawed at me, and I let it fester. On that final day, Lena was over for dinner. The tension between us was palpable, though my husband remained blissfully unaware. As the evening wore on, the anger simmered, then boiled over. A seemingly innocent comment she made about him, something only the two of them would understand, sent me spiraling. In the dim kitchen light, I felt my composure slip. All the buried frustration, the hurt and jealousy took control. I acted before I thought, a single moment blurring into terrible clarity. Now, alone with this truth, I'm haunted by the memory of her wide, startled eyes, that single second where everything changed. And as I sit here in silence, waiting, I wonder if he'll ever understand. Afterward, I stood there, frozen, staring at her lifeless form on the kitchen floor. It felt like the world had gone utterly silent. I could still feel the rage coursing through me, but there was a numbness underneath, a dull throb where my heart should have been. The silence was shattered by the creak of the front door. My husband had returned, his footsteps echoing as he approached. Panic clawed at my throat, my mind racing through excuses, explanations, anything that could make this less terrible. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes going wide as he took in the scene. Lena's still body, me standing over her, my hands trembling, blood smeared across my fingers like a stain I'd never wash away. What did you do?" His voice was barely a whisper, as though even he couldn't believe the sight in front of him. I opened my mouth, but no words came. The anger I had felt moments ago dissolved into fear. I had wanted him to see me, to feel my pain, to finally understand, but now all I saw was horror and betrayal etched across his face. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch her cheek. He looked up at me, the tears in his eyes sharper than any accusation he could have voiced. Why? The question hung heavy in the air, and I realized then that there was no answer I could give that would make this right. In my mind, I had always seen her as a threat, an intruder in our life. I convinced myself that her presence was the reason we had drifted apart, that if she were gone, he would be mine again. But seeing him there, broken, I knew I'd destroyed any chance of that. I thought you'd love me more," I whispered, hating the weak, pathetic sound of my own voice. His expression hardened. The man I'd loved, the one I thought I'd do anything to keep, was slipping further away with every second. I could almost see the walls going up between us, bricks of anger and grief, each one building an impenetrable fortress around him. In a voice as cold as I'd ever heard, he said, "You've taken everything from me." The words echoed in the room, and in that moment, I understood the enormity of what I had done. I hadn't just killed his sister. I had killed any love, any future, any redemption there might have been for us. The sirens were already wailing in the distance, neighbors surely drawn by the sounds of our desperate confrontation. As the flashing lights approached, my husband stood up, his gaze empty as he backed away from me, as if I were a stranger he could barely stand to look at. And as they led me away, handcuffs cold around my wrists, I couldn't bring myself to cry. I'd thought I was fighting for him, for us, but in my blind jealousy, I'd destroyed everything I had ever loved. In that darkness, as the police car carried me away from the only life I'd ever known, I realized something I wished I had seen before. Love doesn't demand destruction, but jealousy? Jealousy will take everything, even the parts of yourself you thought you could never lose. The cell was cold, lifeless. I spent the first few nights lying awake, tracing the cracks in the ceiling, counting every miserable second. It was a far cry from the life I had built with him. That life felt like a distant dream now, something belonging to another person, someone I could barely remember. Weeks passed. I replayed that night over and over, every detail seared into my memory like a scar. The way Lena looked up at me, surprised but calm, as if she knew what was coming. The twisted notion I'd held, believing that removing her would somehow make him see me, love me again. It was madness. I see that now. But in that moment, it had felt like survival. Then, one evening, I received a visitor. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't heard from him since the day I was taken away. Still, a part of me clung to the faint hope that he'd come to understand, that he'd see some humanity left in me, something worth forgiving. But when I was led into the room, it wasn't my husband sitting across from me. It was Lena's mother. I hadn't thought of her until now. In all my spirals of guilt and regret, I hadn't considered that she had lost someone too. She sat quietly, her face worn with grief, eyes searching me with a heaviness that felt like a weight pressing on my chest. She spoke softly, and the softness hurt more than if she'd screamed. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "She loved you like family. She trusted you." Her words carved through me. I could feel the shame creeping up, wrapping around me like a shroud. How could I possibly explain? I didn't even understand it myself anymore. "Jealousy," I whispered. "I thought she was taking him away from me." She shook her head, a look of sadness etched on her face that went deeper than anger ever could. "Love doesn't work like that," she said. "If it was real, you wouldn't have felt that need. She would have wanted you to be happy, to share that love with him." Her words echoed, breaking down every brittle excuse I had built up. For the first time, I felt the weight of it fully, the darkness I had let consume me. I had thought I was protecting something precious. Instead, I had destroyed it completely. She looked at me one last time before standing. "I hope you find peace with yourself someday, because what you did, it will haunt you. It will never go away." As she left, the walls of my guilt closed in, and I realized that she was right. I had tried to fill my emptiness with control, with desperation, and now all I had was a hollowed-out life, haunted by the memory of what I'd done. In the days that followed, I began to reckon with the truth. I could spend the rest of my life blaming everyone else, but it wouldn't change a thing. I had to own this, carry it alone. No one else deserved this burden, and as I lay awake that night, the reality of my solitude sank in. Love is patient. It's kind. But jealousy? Jealousy eats at you from the inside out, and by the time it's finished, there's nothing left to love. The days in my cell blurred into one another, a quiet monotony that left me with nothing but my own thoughts. In a strange way, prison felt almost deserved. It was a place where people were meant to reckon with the worst parts of themselves, and I had come face to face with mine. I tried not to think about him, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face that night, twisted with hurt and horror. The memory became its own prison, a punishment worse than any sentence the law could hand down. Then a letter arrived. At first, I didn't recognize the handwriting. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling my heart quicken as I imagined, hoped, it might be from him. A part of me still clung to the belief that he might reach out, that he might want to hear my side, to understand why. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the letter, hands trembling. But the letter wasn't from my husband. It was from Lena's mother. Her words were painstakingly written, careful and deliberate, as though each one had been chosen with the weight of a lifetime. She told me about Lena, not as I'd known her, but as she truly was. Her dreams, her kindness, the way she had cared for others without hesitation. I could feel the ache of a mother's loss in every sentence, a love so deep and enduring that it made my own jealous attachment feel like a pale, twisted imitation. She wrote of the holidays Lena had spent with them, how she would laugh with her whole heart, lighting up every room. She wrote of how much Lena had adored her brother and had only wanted to see him happy. And she wrote of the pain, the unbearable, hollow pain, of knowing that her daughter's life had ended in betrayal, that her trust had been shattered in her final moments. Reading those words, I could barely breathe. The depth of her grief was like a chasm, and I realized how my actions had rippled outward, how they'd torn through lives far beyond just my own. At the end of the letter, there was a line I hadn't expected. "I do not forgive you," she wrote, her words stark and unwavering, "but I pray that you find the strength to forgive yourself, because without that, you will never be free." The words struck me like a blow. I had been looking for forgiveness, for absolution from everyone but myself. I had hoped that if he forgave me, if she forgave me, then maybe I could find a way to move on. But she was right. Forgiveness wasn't something they could grant me. It was something I had to find on my own, in the darkest parts of myself, the parts I had tried so hard to bury. Into the weeks that followed, I returned to that letter over and over, tracing the words, letting them sink into my bones. I began to see that this place, this isolation, wasn't just punishment. It was a chance to finally confront the ugliness I had kept hidden for so long, the insecurity, the fear, the desperation that had driven me to that terrible act. And as I sat there, day after day, staring at the same cracked walls, I began to feel something shift, a small glimmer of understanding growing in the emptiness. I could never bring Lena back, could never erase what I had done. But maybe if I could learn to forgive myself, to carry this pain and use it to become someone better, maybe that would be a start. I folded the letter and placed it carefully beneath my pillow, where it would remain, a constant reminder of the lives I had destroyed and the path I had to walk alone. The journey to forgiveness, I realized, was just beginning. Months turned into years, each day a slow rhythm that both punished and healed. Lena's mother's letter remained under my pillow, worn and faded from being read so often. It was my touchstone, a reminder of the pain I had caused and the weight I needed to carry. But as time wore on, something shifted within me. The self-hatred I'd clung to started to give way to acceptance, a gradual recognition of my guilt, but also a commitment to change. I spent countless hours in the prison library, devouring books on psychology, philosophy, anything that could help me make sense of the person I had been and the person I might one day become. I joined therapy sessions, even volunteered to help in classes, hoping that, in small ways, I could begin to rebuild. I would never undo what I had done, but I could try to use the life I had left to add something of value to the world I had once taken so much from. Then one day, another letter arrived. My hands shook as I opened it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from my husband. The letter was brief, the words hesitant, as though he had struggled with each sentence. He didn't offer forgiveness, nor did he ask for an explanation. Instead, he wrote about Lena, about memories of their childhood, moments that were precious and simple, a time I hadn't been part of, a bond I could never understand. But he ended with something I hadn't expected. "I thought I would hate you forever," he wrote, "but hate is too heavy to carry. I am trying to find peace, to let go. Maybe one day you will too." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was release, a letting go of the anger, of the bitterness that had consumed us both. For the first time, I felt a strange, hollow sort of peace. His words were a quiet acknowledgement, a sign that perhaps in his own way, he was beginning to heal too. In the final days of my sentence, I often sat alone in the prison courtyard, thinking of Lena, of the life she should have lived, and of the version of myself who had taken it from her. I would always live with the weight of what I had done, but I had learned to carry it differently, not as a curse, but as a call to live in a way that honored the memory of the lives I had shattered. On the day I was released, I walked through the gates, squinting at the bright, unfamiliar world outside. The air was cold, sharp, filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had no expectations, no dreams of returning to the life I'd left behind. But there was one thing I carried with me as I stepped into my new life. A promise to Lena, to her mother, to myself. I would live differently, with humility, with purpose, and with the knowledge that forgiveness isn't granted or taken. It is something we earn, slowly, one day at a time.